when Congress passed the Endangered Species Act in 1973, in essence, what the Endangered Species Act requires is that the Fish and Wildlife Service, a different federal agency than the Department of Agriculture, decide which species are in danger of going extinct in the world. And depending on how close to extinction they are, to designate those species as either endangered, which means they're already in danger of going extinct, or threatened, which means they're not quite at that point, but they're definitely in danger of going extinct within the foreseeable future if measures are not taken to do something about that state of affairs. Once a species is listed as endangered, it is entitled to a whole panoply of protections under the Endangered Species Act. And for purposes of this discussion, perhaps the most important protection is no one is allowed to take an endangered species. And take means, is defined by the statute very broadly to mean not only take it out of the wild, but harm it, kill it, harass it, do anything to it that would interfere with its ability to reproduce, to basically continue in its ecosystem, and to eventually get to the point where the species would be recovered. In other words, the protections of the statute would no longer be needed because the species had recovered on its own and was no longer on the brink of extinction. The statute, which a lot of people don't realize, applies not only to species in the wild, but it also applies to endangered and threatened species in captivity, which is not quite appreciated by many who just assume that it only applies to species in the wild. In 1976, so 3 years after the statute was enacted, the Fish and Wildlife Service was engaged in this process of deciding which species are endangered, which species are threatened. And they decided that the chimpanzee was not quite endangered at that point, this is 1976, but was definitely going to become endangered in the foreseeable future, so they gave the chimpanzee the designation of threatened, a threatened species. And the basis for that decision back then was that the habitat of the chimpanzee in the wild was being destroyed, that poachers were taking chimpanzees out of the wild for purposes of bushmeat and other commercial exploitation, including biomedical research. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service designated the chimpanzee species as a threatened species. Now, ordinarily, if it's an endangered species, it gets all of the protections of the statute. If it's a threatened species, the Fish and Wildlife Service decides how much protection it gets. And basically what the Fish and Wildlife Service has done very early on is it's issued a regulation to implement the Endangered Species Act that says we're going to give all of the protections of the Endangered Species Act to both endangered and threatened species, because we want to make sure that threatened species are protected and can get to the point of recovery where they're no longer foreseeably on the verge of extinction. So what the Fish and Wildlife Service does is it gives all of the protections of the statute to both endangered and threatened species, unless it carves out an exception for a threatened species. So for threatened species, they can decide all of the protections of the statute apply, or some less protection is afforded the species. So in 1976, when the Fish and Wildlife Service designated the chimpanzee as a species as threatened, what it did was it issued a special rule for the chimpanzee. And it said, under this special rule, we're going to say that all of the wild chimpanzees who live in the wild, will get all of the protections of the statute, but chimpanzees who are in captivity will get none of the protections of the statute. That's what they decided in 1976. It had never been done before. This split between how you treat the wild members of a species and how you treat the captive members of a species had never been done before, and it's never really been done since precisely the way they did it for chimpanzees. They've tried some other legal maneuvers with respect to some other species, differentiating between captive and wild. But this split listing has not, it's only been done with chimpanzees. And the reason for it was the biomedical research industry wanted to continue to experiment on chimpanzees and not have to worry about violating any of the prohibitions of the statute. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service basically deferred to that interest and carved out the exception. Of course, that exception also applied not just to captive chimpanzees being used in biomedical research, but to all captive chimpanzees, including chimpanzees used in commercials and in exhibitions and in circuses, etc. None of the protections of the Endangered Species Act applied to any of those captive chimpanzees. Now, what happened was, in 1987, so whatever that is, more than a decade later, Jane Goodall and the Humane Society for the United States, seeing that the wild population of chimpanzees was continuing to plummet, there was a decline, habitat was still being destroyed, chimpanzees were still being taken out of the wild for the pet trade, for commercial exploitation, for biomedical research, for the bushmeat industry. They petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Service to upgrade the status of chimpanzees from threatened to endangered. And based on all the criteria that the Fish and Wildlife Service is required to look at under the Endangered Species Act, it was clear that the chimpanzee had to be listed as endangered because it was really in bad shape. But the dilemma was the Fish and Wildlife Service knew that if they listed the chimpanzee as a species, as endangered, they would not be able to carve out any exception for captive chimpanzees, because that exception where the agency gets to issue a special rule to provide less protection under the statute only applies to threatened species. It does not apply to endangered species. So realizing that was a problem, what the Fish and Wildlife Service did is it nevertheless issued a special regulation that said we are going to designate chimpanzees in the wild as endangered, but we're going to keep captive chimpanzees listed as threatened, subject to this special rule, the special rule being none of the protections of the statute apply, which is why chimpanzees in this country, because the take prohibitions that I mentioned earlier, taking it out of the wild, harming it, wounding it, killing it, harassing it, those only apply to animals endangered animals who are in the United States. So all of the captive chimpanzees who currently live in the United States, in any zoo, circus, biomedical research facility, etc., in the United States, can be taken with impunity under the Endangered Species Act. And so they created basically this fiction that you can have one species divided by the wild versus the captive. The wild could be designated as endangered. The captive could be designated as threatened with less protection under the statute. So that's what the split listing of chimpanzees is all about.